promising economic openness while tightly consolidating political power. What will the latest Communist Party Congress reveal about China's global leadership aspirations as America turns inward? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. Who is the most powerful person in the world? Many would say the US President Donald Trump, but the international news publication The Economist makes a fair case for arguing it's actually China's President Xi Jinping. Unlike Trump, the leader of the world's second largest economy doesn't have to worry about Congress, the media, or for that matter, re-election. And although China has had in recent years a collective leadership system, President Xi is feared because of his anti-corruption campaign and has amassed more personal power than any of his recent predecessors. This is a particularly good time to assess all of this. China's ruling party has a major meeting every 5 years, and it's happening right now. Before we start our discussion, a long-term China watcher, Al Jazeera's Beijing correspondent Adrian Brown, reports from the Communist Party Congress.
President Xi Jinping can control a lot of things, but he can't influence the weather. To the superstitious, and many people here are, the damp grey start to this Congress was perhaps a warning sign. In spite of the weather, this was a day of choreographed unity, after what has been a tumultuous few years for the party. But there was a stirring welcome for the president. This is as close as the foreign media get to the opaque workings of China's Communist Party. Xi reported on his past 5 years in office, saying the party had achieved miracles. He also warned serious challenges lay ahead.
Our country is at a strategic point in its development. The future is extremely bright, but the challenges are also extremely serious. All party comrades must set their sights far and high and think of danger in times of safety.
His address lasted 3.5 hours. If nothing else, it showed that Xi, now 64, is healthy enough to rule for another 10 to 15 years, insist his supporters. At one stage, former President Jiang Zemin appeared to nod off. He was China's top leader 25 years ago, when I reported on the 14th Party Congress, as China began to experiment with capitalism.
The new catchphrase is socialism with Chinese characteristics. In the new spirit of openness and economic reform, anything seems to go. Anything, that is, but political reform.
25 years on, the faces behind me have changed, but the backdrop remains pretty much the same. And the prospect of political reform as remote now as it was then. The Congress will now meet in secret for the next 7 days, after which China's new leaders will be unveiled. President Xi is assured of a second term, and this Congress seems set to cement his position as China's top leader for a lot longer. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
The changing faces of the Chinese Communist Party and the ever so slightly ageing face of our correspondent Adrian Brown. Well, let's discuss the issues surrounding the Congress with our panel. In Beijing, we have Einar Tangen. He's a political and economic affairs analyst. Joining us on Skype from New Delhi, Jabin Jacob, a fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. And in Washington, D.C., we have Isaac Stonefish, a senior fellow at the Asia Society's Center on US-China Relations. Welcome to you all. Einar, I'm going to start with you, because you are there where things have been happening in Beijing. We heard the Chinese leader say that China had entered a new era. What will define this era?
Well, quite frankly, a lot of the kind of things that he listed in his more than 3-hour intense discourse, very solidly delivered, quite a, let us say, a difference from a Twitter tweeting other major leader. But, I mean, seriously, the things that will define China are its outward push. how it deals with the Belt and Road Initiative. They also have challenges in North Korea, South and East China Seas, and how to deal with just the sheer size of their growth. Internally, they have issues that they have to address. But I think you saw within the document that he read, very clear signal as to why he wants his party, his comrades to rally around this, why sacrifice is needed, and why they have to go along with this program.
If I ask you, Jabin, what we mentioned earlier on, The Economist saying that President Xi is now the most powerful man in the world, would you agree with that, number one? And number two, explain to us how he has got more power, perhaps, in the last 5 years in the Chinese political system than some of his predecessors.
Well, I think it's not quite as black and white as that, calling him the most powerful leader on the planet. He certainly has become quite powerful within China. But I think the events surrounding in the run-up to the Congress, as well as, the fact that we do not have a very clear picture yet of who the top contenders are for the Politburo Standing Committee, I think a lot of these things are still, up in the air. He has certainly become more powerful over the last 5 years by his very strong anti-corruption campaign. He has reined in the party's excesses. He has maintained strong control over the military. He has somehow gotten the military on his side, much more so than any of his predecessors. And I think he's done it because he sold a line to the ordinary people, as well as to the party cadre, as well as to the military, that he is out to change China, make China stronger, and his vision of making China stronger has buyers, especially at a time when the rest of the world, the United States especially, does not seem to be stepping up to the plate as far as leadership is concerned. So he's able to sell to the Chinese people that this is an opportunity that has arrived and China must take it.
Isaac Stonefish in Washington, D.C. There are some that are saying that he's emerging as a transformational leader, perhaps like Chairman Mao or Deng Xiaoping. As you know, Chairman Mao established the communist state. Deng Xiaoping introduced economic reforms that transformed China. What is he going to be known for?
I think it's good to insert a bit of hesitancy and skepticism. So from what we can see, Xi is becoming a more and more powerful leader, but there's just so much we don't know. We don't know what his relationship is with other members of the Standing Committee. We think it's quite good, but all we have are the tea leaves that we can see from the outside. We think he has a good relationship with the men who run the military. That's also something we don't know. So if we stick with the assumption that we're making, that Xi is a very powerful leader and transformative in the way that Mao and Deng were, some things we might be able to expect is a far more assertive push internationally. You know, Chinese leaders like to talk about how their country is a developing one, not a developed one. We could actually see under Xi China going and potentially getting involved in conflicts or peace talks in the Middle East. We could see a more assertive Chinese stance on North Korea. We could see more assertive Chinese stance on the disputed islands in the South China Sea and on border issues with India. So there's a lot of different areas that Xi and China might decide to put a bigger push into.
Einar, recent Chinese leaders have done 10 years. They've had the Party Congress where they got given the job. They had the halfway mark at 5 years, and then the next Congress in 10 years, that was when they stepped down. Do you think President Xi is going to step down next time around in 2022?
Well, that's one of the big questions that's around this. A lot will depend on whether he brings in the next two people from the sixth generation who would be capable of serving a 5-year apprenticeship on the Standing Committee and then be able to take over. Obviously, the corruption charges against the former party secretary of Chongqing has made that clear that he's out of the running. Question is, can you bring up somebody quickly enough that people are going to be comfortable with? In terms of himself, I think he has a very ambitious agenda. I think we all agree on that, and he's trying to push it through. Will it take 10 more years? I'm not certain, but it will be in the cards. But one of the things that I think we are concentrating too much on is China is a completely different entity. This is not something where you start putting your political and economic norms from your own country in the West and trying to insert them in China. The fact is, China does not do new plans on the back of a napkin as part of a campaign to get power. It is a very slow planning process that involves a lot of steps along the way. And this is how they achieve a lot of what they've done. So this idea that you can concentrate solely on what Xi is doing or who is on the top standing committee, I think is misleading. I think that the most important part will be the work report, which will indicate in detail what the government is trying to do and what emphasis it's placing on each part.
Einar, you're telling me we're focusing too much on the leader. I am going to ask another question about the leader to jump in, though, which is about President Xi's background and in what way you think it shapes him. Because he was from an elite family, son of an elite official, who then was purged and imprisoned and is in his youth sent to a rural area of China working as a farm labourer. How do you think that shapes his political outlook?
Look, everyone's background is important to how they think about politics. And I'm sure this experience that Xi's father went through in the Cultural Revolution has also affected and shaped Xi, except that, it might not be in quite the ways that we think. I think one appreciation that Xi might have developed is in the power of the state, in the power of the Communist Party to keep things in order, or the need for the Communist Party to keep things in order. So I think to that extent, Xi does not seem to have any democratizing tendencies. He seems to think that the Communist Party is absolutely essential for China's rise. And, so from that point of view, I think that experience has taught him that what China needs is a strong hand and clear direction, and somebody has to give that direction. And that is what I think he's trying to achieve
You talk about his strong hand, and one of the things he's done in his 5 years is a widespread crackdown on corruption. But he still says in his speech today it's a big problem in the country.
Corruption is the biggest threat faced by our party. We can only get out of the historical cycle and ensure the long-term stability of our party and our country if we persevere in the continuous fight against corruption to ensure that our government, its officials and policies are clean.
Isaac Stonefish in Washington, D.C. He says this continues. This fight against corruption, does this help him politically too? Because one assumes you're cracking down on corruption. People are somewhat fearful of you.
I think depending on how well he plays it. On the one hand, corruption is something that's very unpopular in China. There's a lot of frustration you have among a lot of people that local leaders or even national leaders are corrupt and not steering the country in the right direction. I think the question is how much anger Xi Jinping builds among members of the party state for turning off the spigot, and because he's doing this in somewhat of a hypocritical way. The leaders that he takes down are corrupt, if we believe the evidence against them, which mostly comes from the party, which is not an entirely trustworthy organization. And they also all have run afoul of Xi Jinping. So it's not a sort of honest, clean hands, we're just going after corrupt officials. It's going after corrupt officials who, for the most part, tend to be in some ways in opposition to Xi Jinping.
Einar Tangen in Beijing, moving from corruption to the wider economy, what are the biggest risks facing the Chinese leadership over the next 5 years?
Well, if you're talking internally, a lot of it goes around how to manage the economy, But once again, this is not a cookie-cutter Western democracy. The Chinese government has direct control over almost everything. So what you see is this kind of feeling the stones while crossing the river approach. They try something. If it works, they continue. If it doesn't, they abandon it and find something new. This is not something you can do. You know, if you look at the West trying to steer its economies through central banks, which is kind of trying to, you know, cut a wheat field with a razor blade, versus China, who's able to literally say, this is where it's going to stop. We're going to close down these factories. We're going to move them. Things. Now, you might not like the system, but it is a part of the DNA of China that the people here expect the government to deliver some sort of decent living standards. And so far, China has done that. And I think they're going to continue. In terms of corruption, I'm not so certain that my American colleague is entirely correct. If you start looking at the number of officials who have actually been taken down, some of them received rises under Xi himself. And he has shown that he has a pretty even hand if he discovers that somebody has broken the rule. He told people 5 years ago that this is a new start. Everything that happened in the past is the past. Anything that happens forward is a direct affront to not only the people, but to the party, and you will be taken down. I don't know that I like this idea that we continually sing the song that China should do something about corruption, and then when it does, we say, oh, it's only for power reasons.
Jabin, Einar keeps telling me not to look at China through Western eyes. I am going to ask you to challenge an assumption, though, from me, a Westerner, and that is that when you get greater wealth and education, the people will start asking for more freedom, freedom of speech, democracy and the like. Do you see any sign of that, and is that a challenge for President Xi and the leadership?
Well, if there is a sign of it, then it is very much under control. The Communist Party of China has managed to keep it under the lid. It's certainly not playing a role significant enough to change the course or the direction that Xi seems to have set for the Communist Party of China. And I think we just have to accept facts as they are. And I would agree with Einar in saying that, you know, this is not a country that one can view with a Western lens, or even from an Indian lens. In fact, if I might say so, I think it's easier for us in India to understand what's going on in China, because some of the problems that we see in China, we also face. Some of these same issues of anti-corruption are also big issues here. And we see the difficulty of actually dealing with these problems in a country the size that India and China are. So I think, yes, there is a case to be made for understanding and accepting that there is a separate Chinese or different Chinese DNA about how they will handle these issues.
Isaac, the one Westerner who is probably grappling most with how to understand China and President Xi is President Trump. And they seem to have surprised people earlier on this year at Mar-a-Lago when they met in April and got on a lot better than we might have predicted from President Trump's election campaign. How do you see the relationship continuing, particularly as President Trump, in a matter of weeks, will be going to Beijing?
Just one point on what my colleague in Beijing has said. I think a lot of us make the mistake inside China and outside of conflating the Communist Party and China, the country. They are not the same thing. The party wants to have this idea of inevitability, that, oh, China can only be ruled by the Communist Party. Obviously, that's not true. Thousands of years of history before the Communist Party, and there'll be thousands of years of history after. You also have Taiwan, democratically run, which China says is part of China, part of the DNA, but as a democratic polity. So I think we just have to be careful.
You've had your rebuttal there. You've had your rebuttal there, Isaac. Now answer the question.
Sure.
The Trump-Xi relationship going forward, and particularly the important visit of the president to Asia.
So I think what Trump has been trying to do is to use North Korea as somewhat of an excuse to increase trade tensions with China. Trump has this very fanciful idea that a trade deficit is very harmful to the U.S. economy, and he wants to rebalance trade between the U.S. and China. Basically, every credible economist doesn't think this is a problem. Trump does. So I think even though he's going there in early November and the two leaders got along seemingly pretty well when they met in April, I do think Trump would like to have excuses to raise trade tensions between the two countries.
I know there was, it seems, a deal. This very transactional US president said, I'll put all my concerns about trade on one side if you sort North Korea. It seems the US administration doesn't feel that it's got its end of the bargain.
Well, quite frankly, that was not the bargain. This is, I think, a way that Donald Trump has been trying to portray it, so that anything that happens that is being pushed is, of course, the fault of China. I think it's perhaps a clever PR move, but it doesn't reflect reality. The situation is that there's a trust deficit between the U.S. and North Korea because of what happened in Libya and other places where people were, despotic leaders, quote, were defanged and then actually killed. So in that part of the things, I don't know that North Korea and the United States can sit down across the table and strike a deal. So I don't know that that's necessarily China's fault. In terms of the trade issue that is always harped on, that China is concerned about a regime change messily, that something bad happens and you start having, China starts inheriting all the problems. Remember, there won't be many refugees moving from North Korea into Alaska or anywhere else in the United States if things fall apart. So these issues are pretty complicated, but it's clear that, you cannot just say it's one side's fault. If there's no talk, no trust, there will be no resolution.
Okay, Einar, let me just ask you this follow-up question. How much influence do you believe Beijing has over North Korea? Could they change North Korea's behavior if they wanted to?
Not really. If you think back, every time that Xi Jinping has been near an international microphone, for some reason, this is the perfect time to fire off a missile or explode a nuclear bomb. You can just check that, and you'll see that that is the case. Xi is a very controlled person. He does not react to Donald Trump. He does not react to Kim, even though these are open provocations. The Chinese people are not happy about it. The Chinese government is not happy about it. Face is an important issue here. And young Kim seems to delight in making sure he puts Xi's face in the mud every opportunity he can.
Okay,
so that is in fact,
Isaac, I saw you shaking your head a bit there. Very quickly, your view on that.
I think China, as we all agree, is one of the world's most powerful countries. And if China were to decide that it wanted to push regime change in North Korea, or if it wanted to get Kim to stop with its missile tests, it has the ability to do so. Again, massive country. North Korea has always been in its sphere of influence. China just doesn't want to do that because it doesn't want the costs that would be associated with pushing North Korea to change. But I don't think we want to just blindly swallow the party line that China doesn't have any sway over North Korea, or that this is an issue just between the United States and North Korea. China is a very important partner in everything involving North Korea.
Jabin, quickly from you, a last thought on that. How much is the issue of North Korea going to dominate now for the foreseeable future, US-China relations?
Well, let me take a middle path on this. I think China is not without influence on the North Koreans. And at the same time, I think the North Koreans also know just how much to do to stay under the red line as far as China is concerned. I think the North Korean Communist Party has actually congratulated Xi on this particular Congress. So there is a limit to which North Korea will go, will stay under. And I also don't see at the same time that for all the reasons that were mentioned in the beginning, that because of the trust deficit between North Korea and the United States, that the North Koreans will cease their provocations. The Chinese certainly don't want American troops on their borders. They certainly don't want the North Korean regime to collapse. So as important as face might be, the North Korean regime's survival is just as important a national security consideration for the Chinese.
Okay,
and I just think...
Jabin, thank you very much. Thank you to all our guests, Einar Tangen, Jabin Jacob and Isaac Stonefish. Remember, if you're not near a television set, you can still watch this programme anytime on a computer, tablet or phone at our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion of the issues around China, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or you can make your thoughts known on Twitter. We're at AJ Inside Story. From me and the team, until next time, bye for now.